Buenas tardes, soy Arturo Fontaine y les doy la bienvenida a esta conversación. Nuestro invitado principal es...
Guest today is Francis Fukuyama. If you want to follow this presentation in English, you can go to the site www.uai.cl. You can follow this conversation in English. Professor Fukuyama is one of the great interpreters of our times. At times, when uncertainty and hope are intertwined, it is difficult to imagine who can shed more light on what is happening to us. This is the second time I have the honor of introducing Francis Fukuyama. The first was on November the 13th, 1992, at a seminar from the Center of Public Studies. The journal had published in Spanish the article from 1988 in which he published his controversial thesis. And that year, 1992, his book had only just been published on the end of history. It was a very famous book, and his remarkable lecture, The Future After History, can still be read in the magazine Estudios Públicos online. And in that book, on the end of history, a concept which is borrowed from Hegel's philosophy, Fukuyama proposed that liberal democracy and the economy based on competitive markets were, so to speak, the political and economic system towards which all countries were converging. Not at the same time, not in the same way, of course, with approximations and regressions, but in the end, to a greater or lesser degree, all countries were approaching, one way or another, a democratic capitalism. In other words, the confluence of liberal democracy in the political sphere and open markets in the economic sphere was the horizon. It was the suitable way of organizing society, and it had legitimacy. The thesis was based, on the one hand, on the development of science and technology, and on the other, on the search of a reciprocal recognition. A topic about which I will expand later on. In that article, Fukuyama concluded by saying that nevertheless, the possibility persists that the human race will be dragged back into history. That story will begin again once again. The end of history is not so much an assertion, but rather an open question that is still subject to debate. That's what he wrote in that article from 1992. Now, back at those times, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and the communist societies inspired by Marx and Lenin were collapsing like houses of cards. Since then, much water has flowed under the bridge. What does Francis Fukuyama think today? Professor Fukuyama, it is a great honor, a great joy to have you with us today. Francis Fukuyama has published, after the end of history, some 9 important books and many, many articles. Of special interest to me are those 2 extraordinary volumes called The Origins of Political Order from 2011 and Political Order and Political Decay from 2014. Edmund Burke, in whose honor this chair was founded, and Lucía Santa Cruz was in charge of it before, as you all know, was a well-known English intellectual and politician of the 18th century. Just like Fukuyama, he was a keen observer of the pulses from his time, the independence of the colonies from what would become the United States, and also the French Revolution. Although he did not know the nationalisms of later centuries, his reflections often aim to describe and, in part, to elaborate a certain English collective identity. Burke contrasts the spirit of construction from scratch of the Jacobins from the French Revolution
forma
with
gradual
the spirit of the gradual reform proper to a certain national identity of which he is a part and in whose name he speaks. It is a certain fluid, plastic, and open identity, but an identity nonetheless. Burke argues that the legitimacy of the English institutions and the practices that give them meaning rest on an understanding that comes from collective memory. In his book, Identity, the latest published by Fukuyama in 2018, he addresses the issue of identities that permeate modern politics, identities of gender, ethnicity, race, religious, and national identities. The book opens with an impressive chapter entitled The Politics of Dignity, which resonates with particular intensity today in the ears of Chileans. His simple writing disguises the gigantic multidisciplinary scholarship behind it. Fukuyama explores the philosophical, religious, sociological, and economic origins that explained the demand for universal equal dignity. All of these is directly connected to the politics of our days. He takes from Hegel's philosophy the concept of recognition, which has already been mentioned. The demand for dignity is not just something individual, but means that this dignity must also be recognized by others. Hegel believes that what drives human history is the search for that recognition, and Fukuyama tends to agree. That yearning is the key to understanding modernity. This is what very different movements have, such as feminism, the gay and the Black Lives Matter, the LGBT, the Me Too, Islam, nationalisms, they all have that in common. So identity movements are an essential part of modernity, argues Fukuyama, but they must be channeled to avoid fragmentation, fanaticism, disintegration into self-referential and antagonistic bubbles. There is a need then for greater collective identity with a common language that sustains liberal democracy. The Constituent Convention, whose delegates we will elect in a few more days, will be the first one with gender parity and the first to take place in this new world of social networks and social media. The work of these constituents will be immersed in the tensions and achievements, the difficulties and promises of today's democracy. This afternoon, the topic is precisely today's challenge to global democracy. Professor Fukuyama, we can't wait to hear from you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Arturo. It's a very kind introduction, and you are correct that we've known each other for 30 years now, and I'm really delighted that you've invited me to speak. I spoke many years ago at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, and it's good to be back, although it's too bad I cannot be there in person. But this is a good time to have a discussion about the state of global politics and the global crisis of democracy, because obviously we are in a very different period than the one we were in when I wrote The End of History originally, one that's very troubling and dangerous to those people who believe in democratic values. Let me put this in a little bit broader context. Beginning in the 1970s, there was what the political scientist Samuel Huntington labeled the third wave of democratization. It began with the transitions to democracy in Spain and Portugal, in Greece and Turkey. Chile, actually, after the no referendum, was an important part of this, the rejection of the Pinochet dictatorship. And it really culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the transition of former communist states to democracies where they could join the European Union, the NATO alliance, and the like. So the number of democracies around the world rose from approximately 30 to 35 to well over 100, 110, 115, depending on how you define democracy. Unfortunately, for the last 15 years, we've been going backwards. The organization Freedom House publishes a Freedom in the World index every year. They just published their report for the year 2020, and it's very depressing reading. This is the 15th consecutive year in which the aggregate democracy score for the world as a whole has declined. It declined more rapidly in 2020 than in the years prior to that. And the report also points to never been singled out as backsliding with regard to democratic practice. India, for example, fell from the category of a free country to a partially free country because of the restrictions on Muslims, on free speech that Prime Minister Modi has introduced over the past year. But perhaps the biggest change was in the United States, where its democracy score fell rather dramatically. And in a way, it culminated on January 6th when the outgoing President Trump stimulated a mob to attack the US Congress to prevent the peaceful transition of power. This is something that has really never happened in American history previously. And so the leading democracy in the world has also been suffering a deterioration in its institutions. So let me speak a little bit about the different components of this authoritarian and populist upsurge, because the causes of this democratic recession, I think, are complex and lie in a lot of different domains. So part of the problem is geopolitical. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, we now have two big countries that are authoritarian, they are stable, they have consolidated their rule, and they are now seeking to project power outwards. And those are obviously China and Russia. Between the two, I believe that China is the more dangerous country because it is so large and rich and powerful and has a diverse economy that has succeeded in mastering many modern technologies. Russia, I think, is powerful because President Putin is willing to take risks that other leaders are not. It has a much more narrowly based economy, a much smaller population. But on the other hand, its neighbors feel the pressure that the Russian military and Russian use of modern technologies like social media have been putting on every democracy in Europe and further abroad. This is a geopolitical challenge. I think for the first time, you have the prospect of actual military conflict emerging. We just saw Russia mass troops on the border of Ukraine, and there were genuine worries inside of NATO that they could seek to invade Ukraine and reincorporate it into Russia itself. They may do something very similar with Belarus because of the pro-democracy protests that have broken out since last summer. China has been behaving very differently, and I believe is a different country than it was prior to 2013. I think that before the rise of Xi Jinping, you would characterize it as an ordinary authoritarian country. But I remember from those days visiting China that my Chinese academic friends would be able to criticize the government They could tell you gossip about what was going on in the leadership circles. There's a lot of personal freedom that the regime permitted. And all of that is impossible today. I think that the Chinese Communist Party has reinserted itself into virtually every aspect of Chinese life. They have a social credit system where they use modern technology, sensors, facial recognition software to surveil their population, and they can keep track of the most minute details of the behavior of all 1.4 billion of their citizens. This is something no totalitarian regime has been able to achieve previously. And their power is pushing outwards. They've militarized a large part of the South China Sea. They've behaved very aggressively towards India, towards Japan, and many of the neighbors in Southeast Asia, and are posing, I think, a very severe threat to Taiwan. So those are, in a way, familiar kinds of challenges. They're classic geopolitical challenges by other great powers. The COVID epidemic has strengthened this shift away from democracy because it has given democratically elected leaders a good excuse to extend their executive powers. And this has happened all over the world. In Hungary, for example, early on in the epidemic, the Hungarian parliament voted emergency powers to Viktor Orban, the populist prime minister of Hungary. This happened with President Bukele in El Salvador, who has actually carried weapons into the Salvadorian Congress. It happened in Uganda. I think that if it were not for the epidemic, Hong Kong would not have been reabsorbed into China. But the fact that people's attention was preoccupied with the disease gave it an opportunity to extend its security law into that territory in defiance of the obligations that it had signed when Britain turned Hong Kong back to China in 1997. So all of these, I think, are very troubling developments in global politics. However, I think that the more insidious threat is really the rise of populism, which has occurred in many countries around the world, including some of the oldest democracies, beginning with the United States. This has happened in Hungary, in Poland, within the European Union. It's going on in India, in the Philippines, and other countries around the world. And I think that it has threatened the fundamental institutions of a liberal world order. The threat, I believe, is in the first instance, not to democracy as such, but to liberalism. Just to define these terms, democracy means popular choice through regular multi-party, free and fair elections. Liberalism is a legal order. It's the rule of law that puts constraints on the exercise of power, even if that power is democratically legitimated. And what we've seen in populist movements are leaders who claim popular mandates because they have been elected, but want to use that power to erode the rule of law. And so in Hungary and Poland, there's been an effort to centralize power, to undermine the independence of the press, to put political allies in the courts, to subvert the bureaucracy so that it becomes a tool of the ruling political party. Prime Minister Modi has tried to shift Indian national identity away from the liberal vision of Gandhi and Nehru, on which the country was founded, to one that is based on Hindu nationalism, which means that the 200 million Muslims who live in India, many of them have now found themselves stateless because of changes in the nationality law. They no longer feel equally protected by the law because of their religion. And then I really have to say something specifically about my own country, because one of the most disappointing things that has happened in recent years has been the rise of Donald Trump and the kind of populism that he represents. I think that the American system of checks and balances, the constitutional system, was designed actually precisely with someone like Donald Trump in mind, because the American founding fathers watched the history of the Roman Republic, the rise of Julius Caesar, and the way that Caesar undermined Republican institutions. And they worried very much about something happening in a similar manner in their new Democratic Republican experiment in North America. And so they designed a constitutional system with a lot of checks and balances that limit presidential power. Now, I think that the good news is that the American system broadly survived that challenge. I think our former president did a lot of things to attack those institutions. You know, he took away the authority of Congress really to put any meaningful checks on his ability to act by executive order. He tried to stack the judiciary with his own appointees. He wanted to use the Justice Department to go after his political opponents. He also sought to protect himself and his family from any kind of legal accountability. He called the mainstream media enemies of the American people. And so these are very familiar moves on the part of a populist, demagogue, and they directly struck at the independence of these check and balanced institutions. In the end, they held, and he was not reelected to a second term. But on his way out, he committed probably the worst offense, which was to throw into question the legitimacy of President Biden's election, which again really has never happened previously in American history. And so the damage, I think, has been quite severe, and it's not over yet, because at the moment, there's still probably a third of American voters who believe that the last election was stolen, that there was massive fraud, so on and so forth. And so the legitimacy of our current system has been called into question in a very open way. So let me speak a little bit about the nature of populism and why it's arisen in the period in the last few years. The way I define, well, actually, there are several ways that populism has been defined. Probably the broadest definition has to do with a popular belief that there is a corrupt elite that is manipulating the politics of the country and controlling events against the will of ordinary people. And this is something that's shared by populists both on the left and on the right. Another form that populism takes, and this is the one that is more common in Latin America, is an economic one, where populists pursue policies that are popular in the short run, but unsustainable and not responsible in the long run. And this is usually done in the interest of redistribution and the interest of helping the poor and the like. But as we see in the case of Venezuela, those short-term measures to build eye clinics and subsidize food all came crashing down the moment oil prices collapsed. And so this was not a sustainable policy and has turned Venezuela basically into a failed state. A second definition of populism has to do with political characteristics. Populists believe that the kinds of checks and balances that exist in a liberal democracy are illegitimate because they get in the way of the people. And populists tend to have a charismatic style of leadership. This was most characteristic of Juan Perón in Argentina, where the leader gets up and says, "I represent the people," And here are these judges or these journalists or members of the opposition that are standing in the way of the people's will. And for that reason, they become anti-institutional. They want to get rid of all of the mediating institutions that in a proper liberal democracy should limit the authority of even a legitimately elected leader. And finally, there's another definition of populism that tends to be more characteristic of right-wing populists. When they speak about the people, they actually don't mean the whole people. They are referring to a certain race, ethnicity, that excludes a certain part of the population. So for example, Viktor Orban in Hungary said that in his view, Hungarian national identity depends on Hungarian ethnicity. And this creates a big problem because not everybody in Hungary is an ethnic Hungarian. And moreover, there are millions of ethnic Hungarians living outside of Hungary. In Slovenia, in Romania, in many other parts of Eastern and Central Europe. And he's actually given all of them citizenship rights with the right to vote in a Hungarian election simply because they are ethnic Hungarians. And if you remember, this was really the cause of World War II because you had Germans that were scattered all over that part of Eastern Europe. And Hitler rose on the grounds that he wanted to unify all Germans into a single political entity. So I think that these definitions allow us to distinguish between different types of populism. Latin America, I think, typically has seen a left-wing populism that is really based more on the economic characterization of pursuing redistributive policies. Whereas the new right-wing populists, like the AfD in Germany or Donald Trump or the Brexit voters in Britain, have taken more of the nationalist ethnic definition of populism. And it allows us to distinguish between these two types. What's interesting to me about Latin America is that with the rise of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, your region now has a right-wing populist who actually has said some very nasty things about, black-skinned Brazilians, which strikes me as very bizarre in a country where, most people actually have some version of a brown skin, and in which white people are actually something of a minority. Nonetheless, he got elected, and he still has a very strong following. And you've also got the rise of AMLO, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico, who seems to me to be a left-wing, more traditional left-wing populist, and in fact, one that never seems to have gotten out of the 1960s in terms of his attitudes on a lot of economic issues. And so both of the left-wing and the right-wing versions, I think, have had a common corroding effect on liberal institutions because all of these populists are impatient and they want to use their mandates to bring about rapid social change. Let's turn now to the question of why populism has arisen, because I think here, if you don't understand why you have populism, you're not going to be able to counter it. And I think, again, there are several different explanations. The one that is probably the most common is an economic one, that it's somehow a byproduct of globalization and what's called neoliberalism. Now, I want to be very careful in my use of the term neoliberalism. In Latin America, it has become a general term of abuse that is pretty much synonymous with capitalism. And so, all of the left-wing populists say they reject neoliberalism. I have a more limited definition of it, which has to do with a more, it's not capitalism, it's a more extreme version of economic liberalism that was very hostile to the state, very closely associated with the University of Chicago and the whole Chicago school way of thinking about economic theory. Obviously, in Chile, it took very deep roots. And I would say that, you know, in its time, it played an extremely important role because many of the critiques of those economists were actually true, that many countries were over-regulated. They had states that were much too large that got in the way of economic growth. But I do think that, you know, with the rise of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, you had a general shift throughout the Western world away from state-based solutions towards market-based solutions. And the way that that pendulum swung went too far over to the other extreme. And so you had the creation of a globalization that pursued economic efficiency at the expense of, you know, many other kinds of social goods. And in particular, you know, free trade had a corrosive effect on the political systems in advanced economies like that of the United States and Europe, because as the liberal trade theory would tell you, not everybody does better under a free trade regime. And so you saw the erosion of working class incomes and the loss of jobs to outsourcing and the like. And so this is clearly one of the factors leading to the rise of populism. But I would say that there's an alternative definition that is more powerful and probably a better explanation for a phenomenon like Trump's populist movement or the Brexit movement. It may be triggered by economics, it may be triggered by that kind of job loss, but it's much more cultural. It really has to do with the feeling of a loss of cultural identity as a result of the social changes that have been brought about in many countries throughout the world by things like immigration and the economic effects of outsourcing and changes in the economy towards a more high-tech world that rewards cognitive skill and education. There's a new class division in the world that is really based on whether you have a university degree or not. And it also has a geographical correlate. I have a colleague at Stanford, Jonathan Rodden, a political scientist, who has shown that the single thing that correlates the best with who votes for a populist party is population density. So if you live in a big city that's diverse and has good connections with the global economy, you're more likely to vote for a liberal politician. That is to say, one that is open to immigration, to cultural differences, it's not threatened by cultural change. If you live in a smaller town or village or in the countryside, you're far more likely to vote for a populist politician. And this is true almost everywhere. It was true in the Brexit vote, where Greater London voted heavily to remain in the European Union. It's certainly true in the United States, where all the big cities voted for Democratic candidates. It's true in Hungary. It's true in Turkey. It's true in Poland. In all of those places, people that live in big cities tend to vote for liberal candidates, and the populists are popular outside of those areas. And I think that it corresponds to a cultural difference. It has to do with, you know, things like patriotism, respect for religion, traditional family values, all of which tend to be much stronger in more rural parts of the world. Now, I would say in the United States, we've gotten to a really crazy period where it's not just these kinds of identity issues that populists are appealing to, but we've now seen the rise of really insane conspiracy theories. And this brings me to the final big change that I think has taken place in the world, which has to do with technology. We've been living in an internet age for a couple of decades now, and in a social media age now for about 1 decade. And if you think about how people, and especially young people, interact with the outside world, almost every interaction is mediated by a screen of some sort. I mean, you look at us, we're talking to each other via a screen. And that has overloaded people in many ways with information. Ordinary people have access to more information than at any time in prior human history. And I think that in the beginning, people believed that the internet would be very profoundly good for democracy because information was power, and this would give ordinary people access to information and therefore access to power. It certainly has been very good at helping people to mobilize. And so many of the anti-authoritarian movements we've seen in the world in the last few decades, in Georgia, Ukraine, the Arab Spring, and elsewhere, have been made possible by social media and by the internet. But it's also been the case that anyone can say anything they want on the internet, and they do. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or accurate or civil. And as a result, we've seen the internet be weaponized. In China, it's used as an instrument of control. The Russians figured out how to turn it into a political weapon. And right now, in the United States, many Americans are living in alternative realities where, one group of people thinks that Biden was legitimately elected president, and another large group of people thinks that he won through massive voter fraud. And I think that we've not really thought through the full implications of a world in which our consciousness of reality is mediated through electronic media 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Not just the internet, but television, movies, all of the ways that we've begun to perceive reality. So let me close. There are many other issues that I could talk about. I think that we need to think about what the world is likely to look like once the pandemic is behind us. Unfortunately, in many parts of the world, things are moving much more slowly than we had hoped. Right now, India is in the midst of a really horrible second wave of infections, and it's probably going to be, a good couple of years until that comes under control. The question really is, will democracy be weaker permanently? Clearly, the pandemic has given authoritarian leaders an excuse to crack down on their populations. It's made protest much more difficult. But it's not, I would say, it's not clear how things will play out. One consequence of the COVID pandemic, I think, was the election of Joe Biden. I think that Trump could easily have won re-election if the pandemic had not hit, because the American economy was doing relatively well in January of 2020. But he mishandled the pandemic in such a terrible way that it really, I think undermined his authority and led him to lose the election. It could have a broader effect on populism in general, because it's interesting that these new populist leaders are also among the worst leaders with regard to public health. Bolsonaro is a good case of this. Like Trump, he didn't believe that the pandemic was a real thing. He denied all the public health measures that his scientific community were telling him were necessary. AMLO in Mexico, a populist of the left, has been similarly trying to downplay the epidemic. Prime Minister Modi thought that they had beaten the epidemic a few months ago, and he's now getting in increased trouble. And so I would say that we will have to wait and see. The pandemic has revealed a lot of inequalities and a lot of weaknesses in governments all over the world that in a way will give people a motive to push for reform and to push for institutions that will make societies more resilient, and hopefully that will include better democratic accountability for leaders that have been behaving in reckless and irresponsible ways without having to face consequences. And those consequences may still be borne out. But there are many other dangers lurking on a geopolitical level, and we don't really know the course of the epidemic or what's going to happen in the global economy in the months and years to come. So I'm afraid we're just going to have to wait and see. So with that, why don't I conclude, and I look forward to the comments and to the questions from the audience. So thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor Fukuyama, por esa brillante exposición.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama, for that wonderful presentation. Now we'll have a Q&A period, and I will offer the floor to Lucía Santa Cruz. She's a faculty member. Lucía.
Lucía, están en mute, por si acaso.
Lucía, you have to turn your mic on. My apologies. Good afternoon. I have a comment, and then I have a question. In your presentation, you have offered a relatively negative view of the consequences of the implementation of a market economy has had in certain countries because it should have been excessive. I believe that it is to be combined with the fact that that system allowed for the reduction of poverty from 40% in Chile to down to a 10%. And I agree with you on poverty in your book Dignity when you said that the pain of poverty is a loss of dignity, and then you quote Adam Smith, which says that the worst of poverty is that the poor will not feel seen by mankind. So the achievements of what has been qualified as a neoliberalism should be emphasized, because populism may arise from the factors you've mentioned, but also may arise, I believe, from a middle class that goes impoverished because of the lack of access to economic growth. And my question, in that wonderful paper called Liberalism and Its Discontent, you state that liberalism was built around the idea of autonomous and free individuals with freedoms and with guarantees, freedoms and rights. But also, you mentioned that every time is more and more clear that human beings has in its DNA the need of cooperating, of belonging to to communities. So I would like to know how could how the virtues of liberalism, of democratic liberalism, could be compatible or made compatible with a system of organization that will allow for a greater identification, greater possibilities for cooperation, without destroying, without affecting individual freedoms. They are compatible. You say you are. The well understood liberalism, that is possible. So I would like to know what is for you then this well understood liberalism?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the comment and question. Let me make a comment about your comment, if I may. So it's true that neoliberal policies did lead to huge reductions in poverty all over the world, not just in Chile, but in China, in India, and many other places. And so I think that that's an achievement that everybody should be quite proud of. But one of the problems, I think, right now around the world is that as you reduce poverty, as economic growth happens, people's expectations begin to change and they begin to rise. And oftentimes they rise faster than the actual improvement in their lives occurs. And at that point, oftentimes, it's less poverty that's the issue than inequality, that you may be lifted out of poverty, but then you see that other people are doing much better than you, and that very much affects your perception of your status. And therefore, you want something more than just not to be poor any longer. You want to have things that lift your status and make the society more equal. And I think that, for example, has happened in Europe over time. Europe managed to drag itself out of poverty in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but expectations have been constantly rising. The European Union was designed to raise incomes by creating a system of free trade within the boundaries of the European Union. It's done that. It's been extremely successful in promoting growth, but people are still very unhappy with the European Union. There's peace and prosperity, but peace and prosperity aren't enough. They feel that the European Union is tyrannizing over them because of all sorts of little mistakes that it's made, and therefore they turn against it. And so I think, I don't like to speak to an audience from another country about their own situation, but it does strike me that something like that has been going on in Chile, precisely because Chile has been so successful with its neoliberal model in terms of long-term growth. One of the most successful countries in Latin America, if not in the world more broadly. People's expectations have then been pushed up, and it makes them unhappy about what they perceive to be the remaining inequalities and problems in the society. On your second question about identity, I think that first of all, identity it's so much the way we think about ourselves. Every modern person believes that they have an inner self, an inner being that is the source of value, and that inner being is constrained by the society around them. And a liberal society seeks to protect that inner being. The most basic choices about, who do I marry? What kind of job am I going to get? What am I going to do for a living? Can I participate in politics? These are all areas of autonomy that are protected in a liberal society. I think, however, that in many liberal societies, again, that's not enough for people. And, people have pushed for other forms of autonomy. So it turns out when many people look inside themselves, they don't see a unique individual, rather they see a member of a group. And if that group has been victimized or marginalized in the past, then it creates a solidarity with other people in a similar situation and leads to a demand for the recognition of group identity. So think about what's happened in Catalonia since the end of the Franco dictatorship. Catalans, back then were willing to think about themselves as Spanish. There was a separate Catalan identity. But as Spain grew richer and more secure, entered the European Union, those expectations began to change, and people began to think that, the Catalan language and the separate history and cultural symbols of Catalonia were much more important than they had appeared when the region was very poor and struggling and under a dictatorship. And so that became a separate and very powerful goal among many Catalan nationalists. And I think that, that's been going on in many other parts of the world, but it's dangerous because I think that anytime you base identity on a fixed characteristic, like nationality or religion, it means that you're going to necessarily exclude a certain other part of the population. And that's why I think a true liberalism has to be based on a certain kind of universalism in the understanding of human autonomy, that basically all people are similar in this basic human characteristic of wanting to have individual freedom and ought to be respected for that reason, and not because they're a member of a particular ethnic group or profess a certain religion. That's, I think, what has gotten either religious or religious regimes or nationalist regimes in trouble in the past. I think national identity really has to be built around liberal ideals having to do with a more universal understanding of equality and autonomy.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Profesor
Thank you,
Fukuyama.
Professor Fukuyama. We're receiving questions from the audience. I have lots of questions. We will now offer the floor to the economist and president of Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, Harald Beyer.
Well, thank you, Arturo. That was a very interesting presentation, and you touched upon several topics. Now, I wanted to talk about populism and delve a little bit deeper into that, and something that you mentioned in the end of history. Back then, you said that there were three threats towards a liberal democratic democracy. Religious fundamentalism, that nostalgia for the past that could take to inner conflicts, but also nationalism.
Y la pregunta va por el lado de hasta qué punto.
The question is up to what extent is this populism that we can see different ways of nationalism? I mean, if you look at China, Xi Jinping, what has really changed with regards to previous leaders is a strong nationalism, which one way or another has allowed to contain that demand for more freedom given the modernity. Orban also is a nationalistic leader. Marine Le Pen in France, who has tremendous appeal amongst youngsters, which is something that's very difficult to understand, also combines this populism with nationalism. In Catalonia also, there is a certain sort of a growth of nationalism there. And even Putin, in the end, he's a nationalist leader. And then these nationalism are extremely popular because all the leaders that I have mentioned or that you have mentioned too are tremendously popular. And this is really something new from the point of view of the democratic events that take place in countries. And they stay in power thanks to that popularity that they've been able to achieve. And this gives the feeling that the people, that citizens that we have lost the strength of democracy, so as to speak. What's your reaction towards this angle that I'm trying to see things from?
Sure. So I think you're right that nationalism is on the rise in many countries. I actually think that the kind of religious populism that you see in India or in Myanmar or in Sri Lanka is actually very similar to nationalism. It uses religion rather than nation, but they're both tools for mobilizing large classes of people behind a demagogic leader. And certainly in the Middle East, Islam has become a similar kind of rallying cry. So I think there's two forces that are pushing this. One is positive and one is negative. The negative one is something that you see particularly among the right-wing nationalists, that they're basically afraid of the changes towards a more diverse and open society that have been brought about by the liberal world order that we have created over the last 50 years. And this is one of the reasons that immigration is the central issue for many of these populist parties. They don't like all of these different people that are coming into their country. I know in Latin America, the Venezuelan crisis has, it's stimulated similar kind of backlash on the part of many countries that have received Venezuelan refugees. But it's actually, much worse when the refugees speak a different language, have a different religion, look very different from the native-born population. And so there's a feeling that national identity is under threat and needs to be preserved. And that's why, Orban and Kaczynski and many of the European nationalists really got a start during the Syrian refugee crisis, because that brought home to these countries the threat of greater ethnic diversity. But the other problem is more intrinsic to liberalism itself, because liberalism is basically what I would call a kind of thin form of community. In a liberal society, we deliberately stay away from deep bonds based on religion, race, ethnicity, culture. And, a liberal society is supposed to be open to a great diversity of people. And in fact, the reason that you have liberalism as a political phenomenon is because it proved to be necessary as a way of managing diversity. The first liberal societies in England and the Netherlands arose in the wake of the wars of religion in the 16th, 17th centuries in Europe. The liberals said, let's not agree about religious ends. Let's just agree to live with one another. Everybody can practice whatever religion they want, whether they're Protestant or Catholic, but let's just stop killing each other. So community would not be based on a strong bond like religion. It would be based on an agreement over liberal rules. And similarly, after 1945, after Europeans had spent, decades killing each other over whether they're French or Italian or German or whatnot, the European Union was created as a kind of liberal structure that said, let's put nationalism behind us, because nationalism has been destroying European civilization. Let's figure out a structure that, goes beyond the nation. And, it was largely successful in that. But, honestly, there really isn't a strong sense of European identity. If you go to Europe, anybody in a European country is more likely to think about themselves as German or Greek or Spanish or even Scottish or Catalan, rather than saying in the first instance, I'm a European. And so that, I think, is another example of the kind of thinness of liberal identity. It doesn't give people this strong sense of cultural community. And I think that, human beings really crave that sense of community.
Gracias, Frank. Les voy a pedir que abreviemos las preguntas.
Okay, thank you, Frank. I'm going to ask you all to please make short questions and give short answers, because time is running away, slipping from our hands. You have also said, and you have reason to say so, that liberalism has decreased the aspirations of politics. One way or another, it has metaphysical, scarce aspirations in comparison to other ideologies. But it seems like one of the needs of human beings is finding a more transcendent objective. For example, religions looked for a higher goal, But maybe then this vacuum, this emptiness it implies that there are many people that are looking for that transcendence in politics that they can't find elsewhere, and that is changing politics into a sort of lay religion. And that conception of religion is not compatible with a liberal democracy.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment. And I think a number of observers have said something similar to that, that formal religion has been in decline in many countries. You know, most modern democracies are much more secular, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States increasingly. But people still have this desire for higher purposes. And so, you know, the social justice movement that has been embraced by many young progressives in the United States is an example of that. It's kind of a substitute for religion. You know, we have a lot of emphasis ever since the Black Lives Matter movement got started about training people to be anti-racist. And in many respects, you know, so this is a legitimate goal because people are racist and it's gotten worse in the last few years, but many people approach that in a way as a kind of religious goal that is very much like original sin, right? In Christian doctrine, we're all born sinful. Even if we don't think we're sinful, we still have to recognize the sin that's within us. And, you know, the demand that's being made of a lot of white people, you know, today in the United States is that they have to recognize that they are racist, whether they think they're racist or not. And so it becomes actually very similar to a kind of, you know, religious belief in original sin that then needs to be purged. You don't purge it by going to church, you purge it by going to a protest, by, you know, signing something on social media and the like. So that, you know, I do think that there's a bit of an analogy there.
Muchas gracias, Profesor Fukuyama. Harald.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama. Harald, you can ask a question. Yes, you have quite a controversial phrase in your book, Identity, something along these lines. The desire for equal recognition can be translated into a demand for recognition of the superiority of the group. It's a phrase that supposes a tremendous risk for democracy, because undoubtedly it becomes a society that does not have tolerance, that does not accept that diversity. So how do you see this whole unfold? Because what we see in the world is this group strength, this group force that seeks this recognition, and they see this from a moral stand, and they make the debate what that should happen in democracy very difficult. How do you see this developing? Do you think that this is going to calm down, or do you think that this phenomenon will be on the rise?
Well, it's certainly on the rise right now. Whether it's going to be reversed, I'm not sure. So when you think about what's called identity politics, there are two versions of it. One of them is completely compatible with liberalism. So there's one version that says, you know, if I'm African American or female or gay or lesbian, I simply want to be treated equally as other people are treated under a, you know, a universal rule of law. And so the goal is a liberal goal, simply to be treated equally. But, you know, there's a different version of identity politics that says, well, actually that goal of blending into a kind of universal human identity is not legitimate because we're fundamentally all different. We have different life experiences. You can't understand my life experience. And it's really the group that I'm a member of that defines who I am. And, therefore the rights that need to be recognized are not my individual rights that are the same as everybody else's, but the rights of my group. And so, this is what happened with European nationalism, that the Germans and Italians and Russians all wanted their nation to be treated as equals. But the moment that happened, they began expanding their sense of themselves and saying, well, actually, we want to be better than other people. We want to dominate other people and, use our power as a group. And I think what's happened now in the United States is that the demands on the part of marginalized groups like women, like African Americans, like gays and lesbians has triggered a similar kind of backlash, on the part of on the part of white people, where they say, well, actually, we're victimized now because of affirmative action policies and favoritism towards minorities and by political correctness and so forth. And, we're the ones that are being mistreated. And this is not a healthy, form of politics. It's not healthy, obviously, because it generates a lot of anger and resentment, but it's also wrong in principle because it means the abandonment of any sense of kind of universal citizenship and shared humanity, which I think is necessary to maintain a truly liberal order. And that's why I agree with you that, it is a problem for liberal tolerance and for liberal equality.
Muchas gracias, Frank. Tengo aquí una serie de preguntas. Voy a juntar dos.
Thank you so much. I have a whole set of questions here, and I'm going to put two together. One comes from Constanza Michelson, who is a psychologist, and she asks about your mythical phrase, the end of history. And so the question is, in spite of all the criticism, we are still living as if we were at the end of history in economic and political matters. So the question is, what idea of history allows us to understand now the 21st century? And I would like to connect that with another one that comes from Alberto Mayol, a sociologist, who also talks about the end of history. He says, the end of history is a delicate work with a Hegel dialectic. What value do you give to dialectics as a hermeneutical tool today? So both these questions focus on the end of history.
Well, I think that the end of history, was obviously misinterpreted by many people. It really referred to the whole phenomenon of what could otherwise be called modernization or development. And, the question that I was trying to raise is, what is the point at which the modernization process seemed to be progressing? Hegel believed that it was a liberal order, and Karl Marx believed that it was communism. And so my assertion back in 1989 was that the Marxist version of this didn't seem to be true, that we weren't going to get to communism as a higher form of social organization. I actually didn't say that I knew that liberal democracy was the highest, but what I said was, I don't see any competing social orders which look like they're higher than what we've achieved in Europe or the United States as successful liberal democracies. I don't see another model out there that can pretend to be a higher form of civilization. And I still believe that is the case. I think that the only country that could plausibly fill that role right now is China, because China definitely has an alternative model. It's not democratic, it's not liberal, but it's very successful. It's very successful economically, technologically. They've achieved a high degree of social stability. And therefore, it's really the only plausible alternative to liberal democracy as a terminal point for human development. I don't actually believe that this is going to work out that way, but I'm open to the idea that there, is a competitor. I'm not sure that any of the alternatives that have been raised are actually very plausible as real alternatives to liberal democracy. The kind of nationalist regime that Iman mentioned, I think we've seen that before, and they don't end up in a good place, because if you base your community on nationalism, it turns aggressive, it leads to violence and conflict, both internally and externally. I think the same thing is true with religiously based political orders. They aren't able to deal with the actual diversity in the world, and therefore I think that liberal values are still necessary if you're going to maintain social peace. So, I think, I don't know whether that answered those questions, but that's the way I understand my own use of the words, the end of history, and, the way that I was building on the legacy of both Hegel and Marx. Oh, I guess the other question was about the dialectic itself. I'm not so sure that Hegel's version of that is the most useful methodology. I actually think that you can apply some of Darwin's ideas to social evolution as well. It's basically variation and adaptation, in which societies evolve in different ways. They may be random, they may be intentional, but ones that are more successful tend to survive just the way that plants and animals survive, that are better adapted to their environment. And that's the way I kind of see the evolution of human societies over long periods of time.
Gracias, Frank. Aquí tengo una pregunta que viene de
Thank
la
you,
isla.
Frank. I have a question here from Rapa Nui, from Easter Island. Petero Edmund Paoa is the mayor of Easter Island. Thinking about the new constitution, he says, in the future constitutional order of a country such as Chile, what is your view on the participation of native peoples, in particular of native nations such as Rapa Nui? How do you see that issue of native peoples? What status do you think they should have in this future constitutional order?
Well, I think that obviously including indigenous peoples is something that every modern liberal democracy seeks to do. And there are different ways of doing that. Because they are the first inhabitants, oftentimes they're given special rights that are different from the rights that are enjoyed by, other classes of citizens. And I think in principle, there's nothing wrong with that. Federalism is also a way that has been developed to deal with, long-standing communities that see themselves as culturally distinctive, that want to preserve their cultural integrity. And if you have a system that devolves powers to localities, then these communities can control education, social services, things that matter to them as a cultural issue. This happens in Canada, where the French speakers of Quebec have demanded that they be recognized as a separate nation with their own linguistic and educational policies and the like. And so I think there are a lot of ways of dealing with this in, any kind of modern democracy. And I think, as a matter of kind of basic justice, it's quite legitimate to do this. I wouldn't say that the United States has a particularly good record in dealing with, its original inhabitants.
Gracias, profesor Fukuyama. Tengo una
Thank you,
pregunta.
Professor. I have a question from the anthropologist Sonia Montesino on feminism. How do you understand the challenges imposed by a globalized feminist movement whose statements, although diverse, aim at the deep transformation of an androcentric model of society. What are the economic and social consequences of this?
I'm not quite sure what the content of a global feminist movement is. I mean, there's obviously very deep similarities between the way that women have been treated or mistreated across different cultures, but clearly the cultural variation in the world also affects, the status of women. Now, I think the reason that this has become such a big issue recently is that it's sort of a consequence of shifting from an industrial age into a information age or a post-industrial economy. I wrote a book back in the late 1990s called The Great Disruption, where I tried to elaborate some of these ideas that the kind of patriarchal structures that existed in most societies for most of human history were particularly pronounced in an industrial era, when physical strength or upper body strength was still important to many forms of work. But as you had a shift into an information economy, it turned out that women had a much more natural place in the workforce and began to move in every modern economy there. And that was kind of culturally invariant. Some societies were more conservative than others, so the transition took a longer time. But I think that it's something that was going to happen inevitably, that women's social role would change. And I think that many of the, current controversies, like the Me Too movement, are the direct result of that shift. Because 50 years ago there weren't women in workplaces, or at least they were fulfilling very, very different and more subordinate roles, and therefore the kinds of threats to their dignity that had been at the center of the Me Too movement simply were less of an issue back then. But now they're front and center because there has to be this massive cultural change that in men's consciousness that really needs to come about. And so that's why I think we've been going through this. Now, the further question is whether politically there is also something that has to do with the way that women think about politics that will also have a bigger impact. I wrote an article again in the late 1990s called Women in World Politics, in which I argued that the rise of women as voting blocs in democratic countries was actually going to have foreign policy consequences, because across many cultures, if you looked at women's preferences, they're very different from men's. I mean, they're less concerned with national defense. They're less interested in military issues or military preparedness. They're much more interested in a range of domestic policy concerns. And when women had started to vote in national elections, you got strong resistance to certain kinds of traditional international status-seeking, types of foreign policies that great powers had pursued. And I think it's entirely possible that the world as a whole will move. I hope it moves in that direction, because basically we don't need the kind of traditional state competition that has gotten everybody into a lot of trouble in previous historical periods. So I'm not sure whether that responds to what was motivating your question, but that's the way I would look at that issue.
Gracias, profesor. Tengo aquí una pregunta que voy a juntar dos preguntas por tema del tiempo. Una parte de una pregunta que hace el sociólogo Eugenio Tironi, que hace una pregunta sobre el plano internacional futuro para Estados Unidos con el gobierno de Biden. ¿Cómo ve eso? ¿Retomará un cierto liderazgo planetario? ¿Cómo ve la relación de Estados Unidos?
What's the relationship with China, the U.S. and China? Will it have revamping in the foreign international affairs, and copper and Chile, something that was already addressed. If a democracy is not working well, could China become a support of authoritarian regimes? And what's the role of China in international politics? How do you see that topic? In both cases, we have how do you see China relative to the US and relative to the possible autocracies which are coming about?
Well, I think that unfortunately, China is playing an increasingly undemocratic and destabilizing role in world politics. And I think that this really is related to the rise of Xi Jinping when he was appointed the party general secretary back in 2013. China back then under Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao was, I think, becoming an ordinary authoritarian country. They didn't have democratic elections, but there was actually a lot of personal freedom. You could buy and sell, you could move around, you could travel to foreign countries. There was a booming market economy. And there were institutional limits. So the entire leadership of the Communist Party would step down after 10 years and be replaced by a completely new cadre of younger people. If other authoritarian governments behaved that way, the world would be a lot better off. But since Xi Jinping came to power, all of that has changed. You now have a much more thoroughgoing dictatorship. He seems to have a nostalgia for Mao Zedong and for Maoism, and even for the Cultural Revolution. The party has inserted itself into every aspect of Chinese life, and it's been reflected in a much more aggressive foreign policy, which I think has been driving the deterioration in US-China relations. It's interesting that Biden has not changed. The one area of foreign policy that Biden has not changed after he succeeded Donald Trump is in the policy towards China. They began that relationship telling the Chinese in Anchorage, Alaska, that they could not expect the same degree of friendly relations because of, what I think many Americans perceive as a real threat to democratic values, the way that China is treating the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, the kind of aggressive foreign policy moves they've made towards many of their neighbors, the threat they're posing to the island of Taiwan, all of and in general, not playing by rules in terms of respect for intellectual property rights, the theft of intellectual property, all of these things I think are points of friction, and they're not coming from the United States or from other Western democracies. They're coming from China. So I'm afraid that that Chinese influence is going to continue to grow, and I think that anybody that really believes in liberal and democratic values needs to, be aware of this threat and think about ways that we can counter that kind of influence.
Profesor, y si complementamos un poco eso, ¿cómo
And
ve?
in supplementing that, Professor, how do you see the future of Hong Kong and Taiwan given this situation, given this scenario?
Well, Hong Kong is lost already. China was supposed to respect its independence and the fact that it really did have a very different kind of political system. But as I said, because of the coronavirus, they had an excuse to basically arrest all of the leaders of the protest movement, to shut down any kind of pro-democracy movement in that city, and reincorporate it under a kind of centralized dictatorship in China. In the case of Taiwan, I think that people are really underestimating the dangers that are of actual conflict, overt military conflict. It was more than 2 years ago that Xi Jinping gave a speech in which he said that Taiwan would be reincorporated into the People's Republic of China within a decade, and that he hoped that this would happen through peaceful means, but it would happen by force if necessary. And we're already 2 years into that 10-year period. The level of military incursions into Taiwanese airspace has increased dramatically. The modernization of the Chinese military has been very, very dramatic. And the ability of the United States or Japan or any other countries to help Taiwan is much, much weaker than it was even 5 years ago. So I'm very worried about that situation. My particular nightmare scenario is that Russia will move on Ukraine and China will move on Taiwan at the same time, presenting the democratic world with a really terrible situation of simultaneous crises in both parts of the world. I don't think this is likely, but I do think that unfortunately we've entered a geopolitical world in which something, events like that are things that we actually need to pay attention to and worry about.
Profesor, la otra pregunta del sociólogo Tironi.
I have another question from Mr. Tironi. How do you see Biden in this first 100 days? Do you believe that he can inaugurate a new era, as it was with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and close the door to polarization in the United States?
Well, he's not going to end polarization. I think that that's very deeply rooted, and it's going to take a much longer period of time to mitigate that. What he has done is he's ended the era of Ronald Reagan. We've gone through a period from the early 1980s up to really the present in which people accepted limited government. They saw the state as the biggest enemy of both individual freedom and economic development. And that is clearly no longer the case. He's just announced a third major $1 trillion spending program. And so clearly the kind of cautious policies that were followed by previous Democrats like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are out the window. I mean, that's not part of Biden's agenda any longer. Whether he can pull this off is a really big question. He has a 1-vote majority in the Senate. He has an extremely narrow majority in the House of Representatives. And so the ability to actually pass the necessary legislation to enact this program, I kind of doubt is going to be there. And the risks of actually moving down this path are quite considerable. But there's no question that he's shown a lot of courage in, shifting gears in this very dramatic fashion. So, we'll have to see whether he can pull it off or not.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Vamos a terminar aquí la transmisión.
Thank you, Professor. We'll be adjourning the Edmund broadcast. Those who would like to stay with the professor a couple more minutes, so go to www.uai.cl, where we will spend a few more minutes with Professor Fukuyama. So those in email, and go to UAI, you can follow it either in Spanish or English. Thank you, those who are connected via email, and we will continue to spend a couple more minutes with Professor Fukuyama in www.uia.cl. I have, Professor, a question from the Ignacio Briones, who is a center-right presidential pre-candidate. He says, in most successful countries, pandemic control has been based in large part on the use of personal data on a massive scale. In the future, this is a risk for personal freedom. How can the use of data for the construction of public policies be made compatible with the protection of individual liberties?
Well, first of all, I would say that the only country that has used data, personal data on a massive scale to control the pandemic is China. You have South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, as well as Australia and New Zealand, that have had equally successful anti-pandemic campaigns. In fact, some of them have had better results than China without making use of this kind of personal data. And so I don't think it's the case that this kind of surveillance is necessary to successful health policies. But the temptation is unfortunately going to be there because the data is going to be available and the Chinese model is going to be out there as something that other countries could potentially follow. But I think it's very important for us to recognize that there are many democracies that respect privacy and personal autonomy much better than China does, that have also been pretty successful in controlling the pandemic.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Ahora,
Thank you, Professor. Now let's go back to the questions from Lucia and Harald. You have the floor then, Lucia, for one last question. There is a French song, a French tune, says, "C'est la faute de Rousseau." C'est la faute de Rousseau. That's Rousseau's fault. I would like a song, a current song, saying, "C'est la faute de Foucault." That's Foucault's fault. And I would like to ask you whether this actual shift, change in the theory of knowledge by postmodernism, where there is no science, where there is no research based on evidence, because reality would be just a construct to keep the status quo of the power structure. Is this leading to a policy based just on perceptions, emotions? And can democracy make compatible with the full absence, full lack of deliberation based on shared facts in a speech that aims to be rational? How these factors are also contributing to weakening of liberal democracy?
Oh, that's a good question. The essay that you referred to on liberalism and its discontents, I'm in the process of turning into a short book that hopefully will be published by the end of the year. And I actually have a chapter where I deal with Foucault and postmodernism. I think that, as you suggested, Foucault played a very important role in the rise of modern identity politics, particularly his view about language, because he argued that language encodes an existing power structure in ways that people are not fully aware. And I think that the reason that you have political correctness and this extraordinary sensitivity to words and to language really does derive ultimately from this analysis of Foucault that said that the very language we use to talk about reality is not some kind of a neutral window into an objective reality. It really reflects, an underlying power structure that manipulates us and so forth. And I think that's the premise of a lot of critical theory in certainly in the United States. And unfortunately, it's now been picked up on the right, where you have a lot of these populist right-wing nationalists that have a similar skepticism about science, about objective reality. They've obviously got very different political motives, but they end up in the same place. And I think between these two forces, the possibility of deliberative discourse in a democracy is really under threat. And I think we have to therefore push back against that.
I quite agree.
gracias, profesor.
Thank you, Professor. Harald, one last question.
Parece que estás desconectado, Harald.
Perdón, perdón.
Oh, sorry. Okay, in political decay, you mentioned several factors that one way or another have an influence on that deterioration of democracy. For example, you talk about the most developed countries and the relative loss of the middle class has been extraordinarily harmful when it comes to the institution of democracy. And also, you talk about technological changes and the impact that that could have on these people. And you say that in the end, the only way of solving this is through education and skills, thinking that we are at a university. What do you think are those ways of education, those forms of education that will allow us to overcome these dilemmas and to strengthen the new generations? And if I may, another factor that I believe is quite important for Chile, you talk about the deterioration of institutions as an important factor. This idea that you take from Huntington, adapting to social change, how do you see that phenomenon also?
So on the question of education, I don't know enough about Chile to know whether this is something that would apply there. But I do think in the United States, we have put too much emphasis on higher education and particularly elite higher education. So the competition to get into Stanford or Harvard or Yale or Princeton is just ferocious. My own children had to go through this competitive process, and I think it distorts people's priorities, and it also distorts the understanding of social class. I actually think that if I were king of the United States and I could set budgets and make policies, I would actually not put a lot of money behind higher education. I think that one of the things that we've done in the United States is to neglect a skills-based education that on which a strong working class and middle class is based. There are other countries, democracies, that do this much better, and I point to Germany and Japan in particular. Germany has this famous apprenticeship system for training, department store clerks and machinists and welders and things like that. And the importance there is not necessarily economic, although they still, I think it is the basis of the industrial might of those countries. But it's more in terms of dignity. If you go through a German apprenticeship system, you get a certificate, you've had this training, and you have a kind of social respect that you don't get in the United States. In the United States, if you haven't been to a university, people look down on you and say, well, you're just an uneducated, you may be actually extremely skilled. You may have skills that are extremely valuable. Like right now, to be a welder in the United States is to be in high demand because we haven't been training enough highly skilled welders. But, socially, you don't run in the same circles. And I think part of the class resentment that has fueled right-wing populism is that sort of social snobbery that says, well, I design websites. I'm a computer programmer. I have degrees from, the following universities, and therefore I know better than you. There's a little bit too much of that kind of attitude right now. And so I think that could be corrected by a set of different priorities in our educational system that, because 70% of Americans don't go to university, right? And I don't know whether I said that we need to invest in university education in one of my earlier books, but I actually am not sure that that's right any longer, because you're never going to get to a point in the US or in any other country where a vast majority of people have a university education. And if you're therefore going to deal with this problem of inequality in labor markets, I think that you need to, put resources in different areas in terms of how you train people.
Lucía, muchísimas gracias. Harald Beyer, muchísimas gracias.
Lucía, thank you so much. Harald, Beyer, thank you so much. Professor Fukuyama, thank you so very much. Good evening.
Okay, thank you. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Yes.
Thank you, Frank.
Ahí se